these are James Millwood, who's going to talk about the Uyghur situation, Rose PARRIS Richter, who's going to talk about the situation in Iran, and SERKAN GOLGE, I know.
GOLGE, yes.
How do you pronounce it?
You got it almost right, yeah.
Okay, anyway, welcome, and welcome everybody else too. I see many people here, of course, whom I know, and some I don't know. Hi, Aisha. Hi, Becky. Hi, everybody. Hi, Lila. Glad to see you here. Simon again. So I'm not sure, we wait just a minute or two before we start with a presentation by Dr. Millwood, Professor Millwood. Are there any questions or comments, or somebody who would like to introduce? Hi, Rose PARRIS, or speakers. Hi, everybody.
Can I say one thing? One, we're live now on YouTube as well as on Zoom. So I want people to know that. And also Ben will give some instructions on how to handle questions that you have for the speakers.
Okay, Ben, go ahead.
Can I just ask the people who are watching this on YouTube, we don't know who they are, right?
Correct.
So there could be 2 people or 200 people, and we have no idea.
Oh, well,
Correct.
we can see how many people are watching, but you can't tell like who they are in particular.
Okay, so when it says 27 participants,
That's on Zoom.
Yeah.
That's on Zoom. Okay.
Right. But everything that we're saying is on both programs.
Okay.
So
Everybody.
I can start with the Zoom instructions. So I'm Benjamin Richtein. I'm a postdoc at Columbia University, and I'm handling the Zoom logistics today with other members of the Council of Young Scholars. So to make the meeting as productive and not run late as possible, I'd like you to remain muted at all times unless you're the speaker. And then the questions for the speaker should be put in the chat if you're on the Zoom call, in the Zoom chat, or you can also put it in the YouTube live chat. And our moderators, the other members of the Council of Young Scholars, will collect them and ask them at the end of the last 20 minutes of the session in our Q&A period, or they'll send it to me and I will ask them. And then additionally, if you're going to keep your video on, you might not want to use a Zoom background as it can distort your image. So that's pretty much it.
I see. So I'm sorry, is Eugene going to introduce the speakers individually, the talks, Eugene? Eugene, unmute yourself. Okay.
So there's an agenda of who's
Yes,
so the next person is Walter.
Oh, okay.
Introduces the first speaker, right?
I think I will introduce James Millward.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So let's see, where's James? There you are. Okay, great. So James is unmuted. James Millward will be speaking on the status of the Uyghur situation in China. Dr. Millward is currently professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the History Department. He's been involved for over 3 decades in studying China. He speaks Chinese as well as many other, reads and speaks other languages, and particularly the happenings. He's going to speak about the happenings in the Uyghur community of Xinjiang. Dr. Millward has written numerous publications on the Uyghur situation. His specialties include the Qing, please correct me if I'm wrong about the pronunciation of Qing. Yeah. Qing Dynasty, Qing Empire, Silk Road, Eurasian loots and music and history, and historical contemporary Xinjiang. He follows and comments on current issues regarding Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, and other Xinjiang indigenous peoples. Remember, there are others, and the People's Republic of China ethnicity policy. Dr. Millward has served on the boards of the Association for Asian Studies, the China and Inner Asia Council, and the Central Eurasian Studies Society, and was president of the Central Eurasian Studies Society in 2010. He's a series editor for the Silk Roads book series published by Chicago. His publications include Eurasian Crossroads, History of Xinjiang, the Silk Road, a very short introduction. His articles and op-eds on contemporary China have appeared in the New York Times, the Post, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, other media, and he's appeared on many television programs, PBS NewsHour, radio, Seneca podcast, All Things Considered, Al Jazeera, I-24 News, and other networks and programs. Dr. Millward earned his doctorate at Stanford in history, a master's degree at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, and his bachelor's degree at Harvard in East Asian Languages and Civilizations. That is that's the condensed biography. And it's a pleasure to introduce you, not only to introduce you, but to also an honor to have you speak with us today. Thank you so much, Professor Millward.
Well, thank you, Walter, for that, the introduction, and thanks for everyone showing up both on Zoom and on YouTube on your Sunday mornings, if it is Sunday morning where you are. I guess it's Sunday afternoon now on the East Coast. I'm going to share a screen. I've got sort of a PowerPoint here to talk my way through. And there are links in the PowerPoint which I don't think, obviously they don't work going through Zoom, but some of the key things I will either tweet or share in the chat or both later on. And I've also made this PowerPoint available as a PDF or as a PowerPoint for that matter. I think Carol Valoris has it. I don't know if that's appropriate for her to be the broker for this or not, but if you are interested, you can either contact the organization or you can contact me for that matter. So I'm going to try to talk about the history of what's been going on in the Uyghur region. And I'm sure everyone here has sort of some idea about the headlines already. I'm trying to kind of frame it as a historian to look at some of the deeper sort of causes for that, for what's been going on and why the Chinese Communist Party with its policies has taken such a grievously wrong turn. And so I'm going to kind of put my conclusions up front in just a minute, just in case I run out of time, as is often the case in these sorts of things. But basically the main things that we're talking about, and these are kind of roughly in the chronological order in which they began or in which we started understanding what was happening, is this really, Orwellian is the word that's always used, quite incredible, literally incredible surveillance regime that's been implemented since 2017 or so in the Xinjiang region. And of course, sorry, let me just go back to the map. This is where we're talking about the far northwest of the PRC today. It's a territory that's geographically and largely ethnographically Central Asian as well. So, borders on both Russia and the Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, Mongolia, Central Asian countries, Pakistan, and a little bit of India as well. As is probably best known, this surveillance regime facial recognition, of course, we've heard a lot about and how that works. One point that's key to note is the central place of the phone, of the smartphone, in this entire system. To the point where people are required to have a smartphone. Not having a smartphone has been interpreted as a sign of extremism, because it is really the tool used by the state, the kind of pivot point for all of the other technological devices that they're using. Of course, facial recognition cameras, we've seen a lot about mass collection of biodata, from, iris scans, full face scans, blood, DNA, gait, voice, the whole 9 yards have been collected one way or another, along with lots of just traditional information gathered through surveys about people and their relatives, their religious behavior, in particular their travel histories, where they've been, when they've been. That is seen as, has been treated as a dangerous sign for Uyghur people, for Kazakh people, and that of their relatives as well. And then all this information is put into a vast database, often called IJOP, IJOP, but actually in the Chinese, there's another word in there which translates as military. So I'm calling it IJMOP, Integrated Joint Military Operations Platform. And the idea was to load in all the data, and then create a scoring system so that once all of this information on people were there, you could really just kind of hit return, and this data would all be crunched and come up with a score for people. And this was tried out first in a couple of counties in southern Xinjiang, and then starting in 2017, and then expanded over the whole region. And then that score, in a very mechanical way, was then used to divide people up as to whether they would be considered normal, or whether they needed some kind of state intervention about their thinking. And that intervention could take the form of going to political study sessions, but sort of on an outpatient basis or a day school basis, or being interned in one of the camps, which they then built very, very quickly, or actually being imprisoned. And so there's sort of a range of outcomes depending on this really single number score, which came out of this use of the database like that. And then, of course, mass internments in these big camps, which you've probably seen pictures of in the press and read about, really rolling out since 2017. And the goals for this is called educational transformation, or 教育转化 in Chinese. And this created the design of these facilities was taken from the technical designs. So the handbook for building prisons in China. And we know this from released documents that came out. And indeed, they're prison-like with high walls and barbed wire and guard towers and locks on all corridors and doors and so on and so forth. And estimated overall something like over a million at least people put into the camps, with another large number of several 100,000 people in prisons. The elites of Uyghur and Kazakh groups, commercial, artistic, intellectual, certainly, all the professors, started disappearing very, very early on in 2017 and 2018. And they're somewhat different, but they were not the main target for the internment camps and the so-called education or vocational education that we've heard about. Rather, they disappeared into prisons or into some kind of facilities, often still awaiting some kind of trial for some kind of crime. And I've mentioned the word pre-crime and non-crime here. Pre-crime here is referring to really what was a very explicit justification that, again, all of those criteria that were thrown into the database and resulted in a scoring, those were said to be predictive of extremist behavior. Okay, and that was again the open rationale. Like this. So the comparisons to the movie Minority Report are frequently made, and really do seem quite relevant here. The idea was to change people's thinking before they could commit a crime. And again, this was explicit in quite widely circulating party documents. All right, meanwhile, other things that have been going on was a very zealous pursuit of birth control or birth suppression policies. As you know, China has had a family planning, quite draconian family planning policy in place since the late 1970s, I believe, which had slightly different targets for different ethnicities. Han were generally held to one child per couple, although there were ways around that. Non-Han groups, so-called minorities, were often given more, allowed to have more children, but again, with variations depending on whether you lived in the countryside or whether you lived in cities and so on. And from 2015, I believe, the policy was changed in the PRC about one child. And in fact, they launched a pro-natalist campaign for Han Chinese, trying to encourage people to have more than one, which actually hasn't been very successful. And this is because of the demographic misalignment that has happened with an aging population and not enough young people coming along. But at the very same time that the state was encouraging Han to have babies, they were discouraging Uyghurs and Kazakhs to have babies. With active propaganda campaigns, with people out in the villages, with coercive or politically coercive, or sometimes even criminally coercive. That is, the threat of being sent to one of these camps was used to encourage people to have IUDs inserted or sterilization and so on. So that's been another big part of it. Likewise, other attacks on the family. Separations of children seems to be has been very common. One or both parents being sent to some of these camps or being imprisoned leaves these children without a family unit. And very often they've been put into boarding schools, boarding daycare, even very, very young children. And there's a big emphasis on these schools to raise children in Mandarin Chinese and not in Uyghur, with rules against speaking Uyghur for kids. Also, as we see with the labor programs, which I'll get to in a moment, lots of push to move people, particularly young people, young women in their childbearing years, away from their home to other places, to remote facilities where they live in dorms, and in that way making it harder for them to get married and obviously just separating up the family this way. And then a lot of state promotion of inter-ethnic marriage, particularly between Han, Kazakh, and, between Uyghurs or Kazakhs or Kyrgyz and Han. They're not pushing for marriage of Uyghurs with Kazakhs or Kazakhs with Kyrgyz or anything like that. They're pushing for Han to be married with Uyghurs, which, in theory, there's nothing wrong with that. However, it's taking place in circumstances under which, and indeed they passed a law that said that familial opposition to marriage is extremism. And of course, extremism then gets you thrown into these camps. And so we have a situation where, for example, a school or a workplace will start pressuring young women to marry Han men. And in the background of that, or encouraging them, but in the background of that is the threat that if they are opposed to that, then they or perhaps their family members could be thrown into one of these camps. And so it's a coercive situation encouraging interethnic marriage. I mentioned the labor, and again, this has been in the press quite a bit. Transfers both within the Xinjiang region and outside of the Xinjiang region of hundreds of thousands of people, people coming out of the camps in the last couple years who've maybe spent a year or two in so-called in re-education or in the so-called vocational training, are now being funneled into factory work, either adjacent to the camps or sometimes hundreds of kilometers, thousands of kilometers away from home again. This is said by state media to be a program for poverty alleviation. But of course, again, in the circumstances when the camps are literally there and imprisonment is literally there, then when you're encouraged and pressured by a work unit, by authorities to join one of these labor gangs and go work somewhere else, you cannot voluntarily make that decision. There is no such thing as voluntary acquiescence to these programs under the circumstances. So that's why any of these labor transfer programs really are, at the very least, non-voluntary. In some cases, they're paid below the equivalent of minimum wage. In some cases, they seem to be truly forced. And that has, of course, been a concern of the US legal system as well. And then broad assault on Uyghur language, culture, cultural heritage. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. All right, so I'm not going to go through all of this text that I've put up here in great detail, but there's a couple of big things that one should sort of remember about this. This is not really, it's not correct to call this a culmination, perhaps, of ratcheting up cruelty on the part of the state that has been sort of in one direction towards this conclusion. It's rather a reversal of Chinese Communist Party policies. And their original approach to the diversity in China, and particularly to that in Tibet and Xinjiang, was not to provide political autonomy, but to provide a certain cultural autonomy, a cultural space to be non-Chinese, and to even celebrate that, often in the kitschy ways that we see in big Chinese ceremonies, such if anyone remembers the 2008 Olympics, this parading around of all the people in minority costumes, or in the New Year's shows and that kind of thing. But that reflected an overall approach which integrated ethnic identity really within the structures of the state and channeled resources into, according to categories of identity. It allowed for education in Uyghur, education in Tibetan, from kindergarten through university levels. Publication, newspapers, and other sorts of books were published in Uyghur, and so on. All of that they've reversed on now and gone full on into assimilation. So that's an important thing to remember, that they did have an approach to diversity which they've now abandoned there. And then, of course, the other side, so they've switched from this top-down pluralism, or I call it centralized pluralism, to assimilation. And meanwhile, they've been trying to develop the region and to raise standards of living. At least that's the ostensible reason for that. But now they've gone full on into this forced factory labor as the outcomes for farmers, so proletarianizing farmers like this. And this too has not been in keeping with the PRC's own policies that have been very, very successful in raising standards of living, particularly rural standards of living elsewhere in China, namely getting out of the way. I sound like such a free market campaigner here, but getting out of the way and allowing farmers themselves to market their own crops, to go into small business, to become entrepreneurs. And particularly in the poor, rural, southern part of Xinjiang, which is most highly concentrated Uyghur, and where most of the camps and this kind of thing is. Particularly there, they have never allowed that to be the case. All right, and so just to put kind of a systems analysis to what's going on, I figure I'm speaking to a bunch of scientists. I don't know if this is the right way to approach it for you all or not, but I thought I might try and put it this way. The main reasons for the problem as I see them is that they have a very autocratic political system, which has made any issue about autonomy or ethnic identity in Xinjiang extremely politicized. And so it's very, very difficult. So the third rail, it's very hard to talk about. Under those conditions, then, it's very hard for local officials to think of better ways to do things and suggest them up the chain to the top. It's very hard for economists and sociologists, even those elsewhere in China looking at the situation, to suggest approaches other than what the top is proposing, or to say that it's not a good idea, for example, to illegalize wearing a headscarf. That kind of thing, which might have saved some trouble, has not been possible for most, even Han Chinese scholars to say. So choking off of information. Misdiagnosis of the problem, as I'll say, it's basically a colonial problem, or one of heteronomy, in other words, of other people ruling over different people, or being ruled by another people. And PRC has not wanted to admit that. And they have gone really since the 1990s, but particularly since 2001, they've jumped both feet into the terrorism frame of explaining it all, even though there has actually been very little terrorism, relatively little terrorism in the region. But because of that, they see everything through the lens of terrorism, everything through the lens of extremism, and therefore have either cynically or have believing their own misdiagnosis, prescribed the wrong medicine, namely this kind of thought re-engineering, to engineer the religion, to engineer the ethnicity, to engineer so-called extremism out of people through these coercive methods. And then having misdiagnosed the problem and then prescribed the wrong medicine, implementing it top-down with central mandates in a massive, very expensive way, through project-based development, through the high-tech securitization and surveillance that I mentioned before. And I put surveillance capitalism in there. Some of you may be aware of that term. And there are ways in which private capital is also involved in this, through the re-education labor. And then through a different kind of development program, they've directly involved the richest eastern provinces and cities in the Gulag in Xinjiang, and private companies as well, which is all part of the big mess that's emerging around, particularly around cotton, but also around other industries as well. All right, let me check how I'm doing for my time here. Okay, so I've been talking far too long. Let me just quickly run through some of this evidence that there is. Graphic, it's very clear to see what happened around 2017 was this sudden building of these new camps. Right, that's what this graph shows us. There's been some question over the numbers, but whether at 250,000 people, additional people convicted and sentenced over the last few years, and that's what Human Rights Watch says, or according to this earlier report from NPR, using a lot of publicly available Chinese data, more like, let's see, almost 500,000. These are not people in the camps that we've talked about. These are people in prisons. And so a huge number of additional incarcerations have taken place over this period as well in the region. A similar pattern shown in a really chilling way. These are new kindergartens built in 2017 in the southern county of Khotan. And again, these are those boarding kindergartens, places to put these children whose parents have been taken away. For several years, there's been open destruction of cultural patrimony, particularly architectural monuments, some of them really old. This mosque then, it's as old, I believe, as Notre Dame Cathedral. And this gatehouse has been completely eradicated, as we see from satellite imagery before and after pictures. And there have been thousands of local and large religious buildings, mosques and mazars, shrines that have been destroyed over this time, in the name of urban development, but often replaced by parking lots. Direct attack on Uyghur language. I mentioned before rules against speaking it in school, which have been implemented and enforced. But the Uyghur language is written in a modified Arabic script. It's actually a really good script for the language. There's a good match between sound and symbol. And it was in fact implemented under the PRC itself in the 1980s. And of course, all the publication was in it. Now, because of a so-called de-Arabization policy as part of the Sinicization of religion policy, Arabic script itself is seen as extremist and forbidden. So the word halal has been removed from halal restaurants all over China, not simply Uyghur ones, but for other Muslim groups as well. And then here you see on a banner outside of a kindergarten of a school, Nin hao is hello, a polite way of saying hello. And so you get the romanization of it, and then the Chinese for it. And then you have the romanization, Yaksham Siz, for the Uyghur version of hello. But the Arabic script, that is modified Arabic script, Uyghur script, Yaksham Siz, has been literally chopped out, cut out with a razor from this vinyl banner outside of the school. I mentioned some of the forced labor issues there. We can talk about that a little bit more if you want to get into this. An issue of involvement by multinational corporations and others due to this forced labor. And this is what has brought US laws to bear in some of the sanctions. All right, I'm going to skip over some of the deeper history, except to say that there is a perennial problem here, and that there was great costs of maintaining central metropolitan rule over an outlying territory. And these debates have been going on literally since the 18th century, when the Qing Empire first conquered the place. And one of the solutions, which has come up usually by Chinese officials to this, was to move Chinese out to the region. They'll farm, the assumption being they'd be better farmers than local Uyghurs who've been farming these desert oases for centuries. They'll farm better, they'll raise the tax base, they'll provide security through population transfer, and this will lower the costs, the administrative costs of controlling this territory. This argument was made in the 18th century, it was made in the 19th century a couple of times. It's been made since 1949, and it still isn't true. It's still expensive to rule the territory. They haven't been able to develop it in such a way that the costs go down. And this is why I'm now coming out and calling this a colonial problem, not as an invective, although that's how it's heard often by some Chinese authorities, but simply that if you see it this way, suddenly certain things are clear, right? And the expense and the issue of a non-Chinese native population, how do you deal with it, means that you have to have a diversity regime, and you have to be able to develop, and you have to be able to get those two things to work together. Settler colonialism, which is one of the things that PRC has promoted in certain ways, is a tempting approach to this, but it can exacerbate the problem when you're moving Han and when the state is very clearly seen to be financing and subsidizing the settlement of Han people in the Uyghur region, while at the same time providing less resources, fewer resources for developing of Uyghur farms and Uyghur villages. The XPCC here is an institution that has been channeling a lot of that Han colonial development there, and they create state farms literally side by side to Uyghur villages. These are enclaves, they're well developed, they have good water supply, best access to irrigation, they have the best schools, they have health clinics. They have very, very rich pensions for the retirees, the Han retirees there. And these are literally side by side with underdeveloped rural communities of Uyghurs who have access to none of those kinds of state facilities. Again, keeping in mind my limited time, this was the institution I just talked about. Let me speak a little bit about the issue of the sort of question of terrorism here. I mentioned it before. As I said, there's been relatively few incidents that we would call terrorists. Now, when I say we, I mean sort of most observers, most people talking about this. And what I mean is politically motivated attacks on civilians, not unrest or even violence against police or the state, although that is bad as well. But random attacks on random civilians like this. And there really have not been that many of those, although there's a very strong idea that, in fact, the Uyghur region has been part of this. And a lot of that arises from things that happened back in the Bush administration. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the US was looking for China to sign the UN authorization of that war. And a deal was made whereby the US would recognize a Uyghur group as a terrorist group in return for the China's signing of the UN declaration about Iraq. And so that's what was done. And the US chose this one very, very small group that might have had some contact with Al-Qaeda, but was outside of the region. And the US State Department chose that group precisely because it was more or less of a non-entity. But then they made a horrible mistake in making the announcement, and they used all of the language from PRC white paper that had mentioned various kinds of violent acts over the previous 10 years, but had not blamed them on any individual group. The white paper was a list of groups and it was a list of acts. It didn't draw lines between them. The US statement, though, said that this one not very large, not very significant group had done all of the things which the PRC said had been done 10 years for the previous 10 years. And with the US behind it, then suddenly this became what all the think tanks were looking at, what all the journalists were looking at, and this notion that there was an international organized terrorist organization with connections to Al-Qaeda that was causing trouble within China from a base outside of China. That was really created as a artifact of this deal between the Bush administration and the PRC at that point. I'm so sorry I'm running through all this. So much to talk about with this issue. Just continue with the question, what I was just talking about. So you'll see in the first bullet point there, I've listed the four main incidents from 2013 and 2014 there. And these were obviously horrible incidents. The problem is that the PRC calls all unrest, all dissent, any kind of altercation with the police, anything that, for example, farmers marching with agricultural tools on the local state office, things that are more like rural uprisings, perhaps. There has been unrest in the region, but they call that all terrorism, interpret it all through that lens and try to propagandize about that. And in so doing, they make the other interpretations of what could be going on impossible, namely resentment to, opposition to policies, right? That policies themselves are driving people to this kind of resistance. And instead, their argument is that it's mentality, it's extremism, it's religion that is driving people to this kind of thing. And I simply point out, too, that there are over 50,000, and these were reported by Chinese sources themselves, so-called mass incidents of all kinds all over China every year. Sometimes they're demonstrations. Sometimes the workers of a factory take over the factory and attack the boss. There are whole villages that have walled themselves off against authorities because of official corruption, because of loss of pension funds, because of environmental damages, because of selling off of what had been public land or private or even contracted land contracted by individual farmers, selling that off to developers, right? These sorts of things happen in China all the time, and there's a mechanism whereby they're dealt with through demonstrations one way or another at the local level, which then the central party comes in and deals with, and very often by arresting the miscreant officials involved. Now, we can assume that since it's the same political systems in Xinjiang as operating everywhere else, you have the same kind of local misgovernment and similar kinds of corruption happening in Xinjiang as well. But this escape valve does not exist because any kind of unrest or uprising or expression of dissent is treated as terrorism and cracked down on brutally. And so I'll just end by saying, although there have been incidents there in Xinjiang until 2017, we really don't know why. The state alleges that they're religious or that they're separatists, but we really don't know why. They could be simply unrest at local officials. All right, I will leave. I think I have to get off here, and another speaker will be speaking. I'll put some of these links in the chat, and then I will tweet them as well, and we can come back to these things in the Q&A later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
There is, it's actually 12:40, and it's now that we're supposed to begin the presentation by Rose PARRIS Richter on the human rights situation in Iran. There's certainly not enough time to discuss everything. We've been spending as CCS, as the organization itself, great deal of energy and time, and do check out our website on matters related to the Uyghurs. But I must say that like so many others, we are, as an organization, appalled by the situation in Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. It just makes one think that, maybe part of the mentality is that this too shall pass. Other things have happened in the People's Republic of China, such as Tibet, that hardly anybody thinks about anymore. But it's not over. This is going on, and it's very much alive. And I think it's really important, and I speak for myself, but I think I'm also speaking for CCS, to focus on it and to continue focusing on it, and to remain, as the UN says, seized with the matter. And thank you very much, Professor MILLWARD, for presenting so concisely this very, very large issue, so that we can continue our own work. And we hope to be in touch with you in the future if we may.
Certainly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think Alec Greer is next, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Professor MILLWARD. It's a wonderful presentation. So I'm very pleased to introduce our second speaker, Rose PARRIS Richter. Ms. Richter received her bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in political science. She attended Hawaii Pacific University, the University of Maryland, as well as Long Island University. Her efforts with the United Nations on human rights projects have spanned over a decade. For example, Ms. Richter has served as the senior advisor for the Special Rapporteur on human rights for the situation in Iran. She currently serves as the Chief of Staff for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. She is the Executive Director of the Human Rights in Iran Unit. This is located at the Ralph Bunche Institute of the City University of New York's Graduate Center. She also teaches a course at Brooklyn College titled Documenting and Reporting Human Rights Abuses Using Testimony. This course not only involves interviewing victims of human rights abuses, but also proper documenting of their cases, raising awareness of human rights abuses, and also instructing students on formulating research plans on the subject. So I'm very pleased to welcome Rose as our speaker, for our second speaker for our Committee of Concerned Scientists annual meeting. Welcome.
Thank you, Alex. I am pleased to be here. I don't have visual tools as Professor Miller did, but I'll do my best to convey the information that I think will be of interest to you this afternoon without those tools. I guess I chose to focus on the impact of international interventions on the situation of human rights in Iran, because I think the question of whether or not such interventions have served to actually improve the situation on the ground over the years loom large for the international human rights community, and certainly has been a recurring question that has been posed to Iranian human rights defenders that I've worked with over the years, and perhaps it's a question that's been pondered by some of you in this meeting today. But first, I'll start off by noting that the situation of human rights in Iran continues to engender alarm among international accountability and compliance mechanisms. In their most recent reports to the United Nations Human Rights Council this past March, for example, both the UN Secretary General and the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran both raised concerns about the government's ongoing abuses in its application of capital punishment. They noted its concern about its treatment of human rights defenders, its treatment of religious and ethnic minorities in the country, and they both documented a range of serious concerns about violations of a number of other civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights of Iranians living within Iran's jurisdiction. The allegations presented in both of these reports have been repeatedly raised by a number of other international human rights mechanisms over the past 3 decades, including the treaty bodies, numerous thematic UN special procedures, and state-led processes like the Universal Periodic Review, which is ultimately a process where UN member states come together, review each other's human rights records, and offer recommendations for addressing concerns that they believe need to be dealt with by the Iranian government in order to improve respect for the human rights for human rights in Iran. The Iranian government, in turn, has received hundreds of recommendations from these international human rights mechanisms over the past 3 decades to address many of the concerns raised by international human rights organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, and by Iranian human rights defenders located both inside and outside the country. But what impact, if any, have these international interventions to promote respect for human rights in Iran had on the situation on the ground over the years? The concise answer to that question is that the international community has witnessed really sort of painfully incremental reforms in the country's laws and policies over the past decade, and change that arguably has come in large part as a result of the relentless efforts of Iranian human rights defenders and their investments in multilateral institutions and international advocacy as a means for generating the civic spaces that don't exist in Iran, and as a means for raising public awareness, for stimulating domestic debate, and for motivating action towards reform. But overall, the harmful practices and attitudes of authorities that undermine respect for human rights in Iran die hard. I wanted to note this afternoon that this past March marks the 10th anniversary of the UN Human Rights Council's decision to intervene in the situation of human rights in Iran. After close to 5 years of advocacy by Iranian civil society and international human rights organizations, 22 members of the 47-member body voted in March 2011 to establish a mechanism to monitor, report, and engage publicly on issues which undermine the government's capacity to promote, protect, and fulfill its international human rights obligations. Mandate holders appointed to carry out the work of this special procedure were tasked to undertake fact-finding missions, to provide annual reports to the United Nations on the country's situation, and to engage directly with the government on allegations of rights abuses through meetings with officials, through allegation and urgent letters and urgent appeals issued to various aspects of the state, and through engagement with the media. They were also tasked to make recommendations to the Council and the Iranian government for addressing these human rights violations and abuses. Now, proponents of establishing this mechanism argued that the lack of cooperation from the government with various aspects of the UN human rights system amid widespread reports of systematic human rights violations emanating from the country warranted serious concern and special attention. At the time, the Iranian government had failed to engage with much of the UN system back in 2011. It hadn't reported to the treaty bodies in some cases for close to 10 years. It had refused to let special procedures into the country to carry out those fact-finding missions, and it had refused to engage with any of the communications issued by the UN system to try to retrieve information, to get the government's opinion or side of the story about whatever allegations have been raised by Iranians to these bodies. In one study of the government's responses to urgent appeals and allegation letters issued by these special procedures showed that the government took steps to address issues in just 1% of all of the allegation letters issued between 2004 and 2008. It had categorically rejected allegations in about a quarter of all of the letters issued, some 500 communications over this course of time. And it had been totally unresponsive to 60% of all communications issued in that time frame. Opponents of establishing the special procedure, including the Iranian government, the government of China, the Russian government, the government of Cuba, all categorically rejected the council's decision. And some officials asserted that the decision to establish such a special procedure was selective, politicized, and Iranian officials at the time declared that the government would refuse to cooperate with the mandate holders that were appointed to the mechanism. But for Iranian human rights defenders, the mandate and its activities would afford victims and affected communities an opportunity to tell their stories, to generate visibility about the pressing issues and emerging concerns that affected their daily lives, to influence the discourse around domestic issues, and to mobilize international pressure and action towards reform and remedy. The government's declaration that it wouldn't cooperate with the mandate did pose some serious implications for its work. If the government wouldn't let the special rapporteur into the country, then he or she couldn't visit places of interest, they couldn't interview victims of abuse, they couldn't engage with policymakers and other officials on ways in which they could ameliorate the human rights situation. And a lack of government cooperation meant that the special rapporteur would have a hard time building the body of evidence necessary for the council to engage in an informed way on the issues they hoped the mandate would help them address. Such a predicament really just threatened to make the mandate irrelevant and made its existence quite tenuous. But over the years, since its establishment, Iranian human rights defenders located both inside and outside the country have worked to mitigate the impact of non-cooperation on the mandate's work. Their innovative approaches have, over the years, been able to help the special mandate holder extract qualitative and quantitative information from affected communities, from victims in almost every province in the country. They've held panel discussions, they've held briefings and other activities on the sidelines of intergovernmental debates at the UN, and work to inform a range of international compliance and accountability mechanisms about poorly understood issues, about the status of individuals in detention, and to bring international pressure to bear, which has, in some cases, reversed capital punishment sentences or helped to free human rights defenders detained from merely exercising the right to freedom of expression. I guess one of the most significant steps towards reform taken by the government over the past decade amid all of this work have been changes in the government's use and means for carrying out capital punishment. This is that the de jure and de facto changes for the range of offenses for which capital punishment is applied has resulted in changes in the ways in which capital punishment has been carried out and for the offenses for which it is applied. In 2010, for example, the government accepted 3 recommendations during that universal periodic review I mentioned earlier. The 3 recommendations included a recommendation to reconsider its inclusion of apostasy, witchcraft, and heresy as capital offenses. It also received a recommendation to consider the abolition of juvenile executions, and it received a recommendation to respect the minimum standards and provisions set out in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child concerning the death penalty. But at the start of his mandate in 2011, the first special rapporteur appointed to this mechanism, I mentioned earlier, noted that human rights organizations were reporting something around 676 executions that year, more individuals executed per capita than any other country in the world. And the government's attitude towards calls for reforms in its use of the death penalty at the time was quite combative. Iranian officials categorically defended their use of hangings, as well as secret executions. They defended their use of public executions as critical tools for deterrence against acts they considered to be capital offenses such as apostasy, adultery, homosexuality, drug possession, recidivist alcohol consumption, and vaguely worded national security crimes such as the offense of waging war against God. But amid much international pressure and advocacy by Iranian human rights defenders, we started to see a shift during international debates in the government's attitude towards calls for changes with regard to its use of the death penalty. One of the first of such shifts emerged with the adoption of the new Islamic Penal Code that was entered into force in 2013. The new body of laws did take two of those three recommendations I mentioned earlier by actually omitting the offenses of apostasy, witchcraft, and heresy as capital offenses. But the penal code continued to allow for juvenile executions, and it retained the death penalty for activities that did not constitute most serious crimes under international law. Crimes such as adultery, as I said before, alcohol use, drug possession, and trafficking, and crimes that translate loosely into enmity against God. But amendments to the Islamic Penal Code did later repeal capital punishment for juveniles found guilty of drug-related offenses, and now require a judge to determine whether or not these defendants understood the consequences of their actions at the time they committed said act. And in January of 2015, the Supreme Court issued a ruling requiring all courts to apply this new amendment retroactively to cases adjudicated prior to 2013 if a juvenile defendant petitioned for an appeal. Despite these changes, however, the rate of executions in Iran continued to increase at an alarming rate. By the end of 2015, human rights organizations estimated that between 966 and over 1,054 executions took place in that year alone, the highest rate in over 20 years. And they reported that several stoning sentences, which hadn't been seen in some time, were issued to women for the crime of adultery that year. The majority of these executions were carried out to punish drug-related offenses. Again, a crime not considered most serious under international law, not considered to be a capital offense under international law, including the crime of possession of small quantities of controlled substances. The high rate of executions that year prompted both a number of special of human rights mechanisms and experts, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to issue two public statements that appeal to the government to issue a moratorium on the use of death penalty and to end unlawful executions of juvenile offenders. In its responses to these concerns, including Special Rapporteur's concerns about the use of the death penalty, the government noted that the death penalty was, in fact, its most effective deterrence to drug offenses. And authorities affirmed the stoning sentences that were issued that year. They defended the practice, but amid, I believe, much international pressure, they also informed the Special Rapporteur that these sentences would be converted, had been or would be converted to other forms of punishment. And this was an assertion that was a stark departure from the government's defense of the practice over the years, that the criminalization of adultery is consistent with its interpretation of Islamic law, and that stoning was an effective deterrent. A notable shift in the government's position on the use of capital punishment for drug offenses was observed again in 2014 when the head of the country's High Council for Human Rights in Iran, Dr. Mohammad Javad Laranjani, iterated calls during his engagement with the UN Special Rapporteur and members of the Human Rights Council that the country should amend its anti-narcotics laws. He maintained during that time that perhaps a reconsideration of the effectiveness of such laws should be undertaken, and noted that a policy shift in this regard would in fact reduce the execution rate by about 80%. Capital punishment for drug-related offenses in the country was governed by the anti-narcotics law, which mandated the death penalty for 17 offenses. And in addition to a broad range of crimes for which the death penalty was prescribed, the mandate is automatically triggered when a minimum amount of contraband is involved. The following year, after Mr. Laranjani's statement at the UN Human Rights Council in December of 2015, some 70 parliamentarians presented a bill to reduce the punishments for nonviolent drug crimes from death to life imprisonment. And after decades of debate, the parliament did approve a bill that amended drug trafficking laws to curtail the application of death penalty for certain drug offenders. The amendment increased the minimum amounts of illicit drugs that would be subjected to capital punishment, raising the levels from 30 grams for synthetic substances such as heroin, cocaine, and amphetamines from 30 grams to 2 kilos, and raising the level of what the government considered to be natural substances like opium and marijuana from 5 kilos to 50 kilos before it was considered a capital offense. Since then, though, the number of executions carried out in the country dropped by at least 60%. In his most recent report to the council, for example, the current special rapporteur on Iran, Javed Rahman, reported that some 233 executions have been carried out in the country this past year. This is significantly lower than the 900 plus executions we were seeing back in 2015 carried out by the authorities, and significantly lower than the average rate carried out by authorities in the last decade. I believe that these major changes couldn't have taken place without the concerted efforts of Iranian human rights defenders working to mobilize international pressure and action over this past decade. I guess I can say that a couple of other important steps towards reforms have been made amid international pressure and the work of human rights defenders located inside and outside the country. One such change would involve reforms to the administration of justice in the last 5 years. In June 2015, the government adopted the much anticipated Code of Criminal Procedure that we like to call the CCP, which was entered into force that year. The new CCP passed by the parliament replaced a deeply flawed criminal procedure code and introduces reforms in that, including restrictions on the use of provisional pretrial detention to situations where the risk of flight and threat to public safety was low. There were stricter regulations on how the government could question accused persons, and there was an enhancement in the right to access to a lawyer during pretrial detention periods. Regardless of these new amendments, the body of the criminal procedure code still fails to address many of the major shortcomings in Iran's criminal justice system raised by international human rights mechanisms and Iranian legal experts over the years. But the incremental change, I think, should be noted and certainly presents an opening for more reform moving forward. The amendments certainly, but a number of amendments since the adoption of this new criminal procedure have in fact effectively rolled back some of the perfunctory reforms that were repeatedly used by the authorities to showcase their commitment to reform of the country's criminal justice system in the face of both domestic and international pressure. And we hope moving forward that the international community will remain engaged to encourage the government to continue to move forward in terms of both allowing for more access to due process rights and fair trial standards. I guess a couple of other small changes that have been observed this past decade since international pressure has really sort of ramped up has been small but positive moves in strengthening protections for the human rights of women and girls in the country. The criminal justice system discriminates between men and women in myriad ways. But in one particular aspect, it regards men and women in terms of their worth to be half that of a man. For example, when there's compensation for loss of life or limb during an accident or a purposeful act, the compensation for that loss for a woman is regarded to be, or regarded to be half that of a man. This is called the dia, or blood money, paid for compensation in such instances. In June 2019, however, the Iranian Supreme Court upheld a law deciding that blood money compensation paid to relatives for death or injury of a family member would be equal between men and women, and no longer would women's compensation be worth half that of a man's. According to this law, a fund for physical damages would make up the difference in all incidents, and not just car accidents, but any incidents where a woman's life or limb had been affected. And the law was structured so as to not contradict Sharia law and its position about the worth of a man and a woman, but it did effectively circumvent Sharia law of this matter. This call for equality in the issuance of dia, or blood money, has been raised and argued in Iranian's parliament for over a decade. And the ruling really did, I think, was the result of decades-long advocacy by women human rights defenders located inside and outside the country since 1994. Other changes include a recent approval of the law allowing Iranian mothers who are married to foreigners to pass their citizenship on to their children, ending a struggle for decades by campaigners to reform this discriminatory practice. This new law means that women living abroad who are married to a foreigner can now obtain a passport for their child to travel to visit relatives without obtaining a visa. But the largest number of Iranian women partnered with foreign men live in Iran and are married to Afghan immigrants and refugees. It should be noted here that many of the reforms made by the government after a decade of debate with international human rights mechanisms and amid 3 decades of advocacy by international human rights organizations and Iranian human rights defenders located inside and outside the country have avoided directly dealing with what is called hudud offenses, or reforming or rescinding laws and practices that are directly informed by Sharia law. This includes offenses such as rape, fornication, adultery, alcohol consumption, which constitute crimes considered to be claims of God laid out in the Quran and require specific mandatory punishments. Instead, reforms have largely centered on addressing tazir offenses deemed to be crimes whose punishment is left up to the discretion of the state, including bribery, eating prohibited food, wearing improper hijab, and such things as dia money. Really, they've not changed Sharia law per se, but found ways to circumvent such positions and interpretations of Sharia law to make reforms that it felt it had to in order to address international pressure. I wish to stress after a decade of doing this work, the important role that international interventions have brought to bear on by Iranian human rights defenders, the role that it's played, which has been indispensable in promoting much needed international dialogue, in promoting domestic debate, and changes in the approaches of the authorities to pressing issues that have been laid out in my presentation today. And although I wish to stress that many obstacles remain, I believe that the international community's investment in these actions have yielded some positive potential. This potential is evidenced by the constructive, albeit quite incremental steps taken by the government to address some international and national concerns raised over the years, and the proliferation of human rights dialogues between member states and the Iranian government. I believe that the international community has to continue, however, to find effective and creative ways to engage with Iran on human rights as Iran itself seeks to broaden their political, economic, and cultural relationships with the rest of the world. Increasing engagement with the Iranian government and continued focus on its human rights record are not and need not be mutually exclusive realities. And as I've said before, Iran's engagement with the world provides a golden opportunity not only to reach out to our own governments, world leaders, and international businesses seeking to invest in Iran to do their part in ensuring that we're ensuring respect for human rights in the country. Such engagement shouldn't proceed at the expense, must not proceed at the expense of clear and strong support for better human rights protections, without which there will be no long-term dividends. I do hope that committees like yours, that other international human rights organizations do remain committed to focusing on raising international concern and pressure to bring to bear on the government in order to make the changes and reforms that will help Iranians to lead better lives and to enjoy at some point their full human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Richter. We're running a couple of minutes late, so perhaps we can carry on. I could at least say that hopefully we could interact more so between the CCS and your efforts. Certainly, we'd be eager to do that. So thank you once again for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Appreciated. Okay, and Eugene, for the
Thank you.
for the next introduction.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce SERKAN GOLGE. The Committee of Concerned Scientists worked hard to get him out of Turkish prison since his unlawful arrest in 2017. Today, Dr. Golge is a free man and a senior research scientist at the University of Houston, NASA Johnson Space Center. He works on the radiation environment as related to space missions. Dr. Golge earned his bachelor's degree from Fatih University in Istanbul. He received his doctorate from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. He became US citizen in 2010. Until 2016, he worked and lived in Houston with his family in a house that they owned. In summer 2016, Dr. Golge was unjustly and unlawfully imprisoned by the Turkish government following a failed coup attempt by a faction of the Turkish military that took place while Dr. Golge was visiting Turkey. He was falsely and without any evidence accused of helping to overthrow the Turkish government. For a good part of his time in prison, he was detained in solitary confinement. In May 2019, he was released and placed under house arrest. In June 2020, he was finally allowed to return to the United States and to his position at NASA. Today, Dr. Golge will be sharing his experiences about 4 years of unlawful detention and isolation in a Turkish prison. Serkan, please.
It's nice meeting you all. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Good, good. Allow me my screen. Okay. All right. I think I did, right?
Yeah, just go to presentation mode. And click the fourth button on the bottom panel, or you can go to slideshow and then do presentation.
Okay. Just give me a second. Here it is.
Yeah, that's the button.
All right. So good, right?
Yeah.
All right. So it's been an honor to meet with you guys and come back here and start working here. So I want you to guys shift your mindsets from Iran and China. I am going to be speaking about Turkey, which is supposedly be a NATO country and was supposedly be entering the European Union. So, and this will be an interesting thing. So I'll be talking about 4 years of unlawful detention, isolation experience, and human rights violations in Turkey. So this is how I was able to see the sky for the 3 years in Turkey. This is for reference only, though. It's just a typical Turkish isolation cell, that refreshment area. I found a photo from the internet. It exactly looked like mine. High walls, small space, that I was able to see the sky. So, so let me pose you this question first. Could academics, scientists, judges, diplomats, teachers, college students be terrorists? An ice cream seller organize a military against the government and the terrorists. The housewives could be terrorists. Could a physicist who happens to be at the wrong place and the wrong time be working for NASA, be working for the CIA, be a member of an armed terrorist organization, and be spending his precious vacation hours all at the same time? Well, I'm a physicist, and according to the quantum physics, I shall respond yes and no at the same time. But just bear with me and let's look at the evidence before saying yes or no. Let me speak a little bit about myself. I graduated in 2002 from Fatih University in Istanbul, Turkey. I received a full Turkish government scholarship from the Turkish government, actually, to go to that school. And between 2003 and 2013, I came to Old Dominion University as a teaching and research assistant. I got my PhD from physics in 2010, and then I started as a senior research scientist as a contractor at Johnson NASA Space Center through University of Houston. I studied the long-term health of radiation effects coming from space and long-term health effects of human crew for the International Space Station and future missions such as to Mars or Moon. So in July 2016, I traveled with my wife and kids to my hometown, Antakya. As we did every year. While I was there on July 15th, 2016, a faction in the Turkish military started a coup against the Turkish government, which sadly resulted in the death of 251 citizens and left thousands injured. So what happened actually on July 15th, 2016 in Turkey? Well, nobody knows for sure. There are a lot of claims. But basically, what I know, at least on my part, is a faction, about a few hundred high-ranking military officers, started a coup attempt. And as a result of this heinous act, 251 Turkish citizens were killed, sadly. Thousands were injured. unfortunately. But according to their testimonies, most of these soldiers thought they were taking place in military exercise. But some of them, unfortunately, used the power deposited in their hands against innocent people to overthrow the government. So, wholly unrelated to the coup attempt, using the coup attempt as a leverage, the Turkish government arrested, even prior to arresting the coup plotters, about 4,000 judges and prosecutors immediately. Over a period, more than 500,000 people were detained, including foreign citizens. Among arrested were teachers, physicians, academics, lawyers, police officers, governors, just regular citizens ranging from 18 to 80 years old, including disabled and pregnant women. Many still wonder how the government carried out the arrest and dismissed in less than a few days following July 15, 2016. So the aftermath of July 15 attempt in Turkey was the government fired 150,000 civil servants and 160,000 people were arrested. As I said, 500,000 or even more were detained, arrested, or suffered a criminal investigation. 3,000 private schools, universities, dormitories were shut down, which were allegedly in the Gulen network. 4,000 judges and public prosecutors were fired, arrested. 300 journalists were arrested. 6,000 academics lost their jobs with no possibility to be employed anywhere else in Turkey. They couldn't leave Turkey either because the Turkish government blocked over 400,000 passports. So that's what happened on July 15th of 2016. So why am I telling you this? Now, back to my story. On 23rd of July 2016, I purchased my US return to months prior to my vacation. So as I packed and was getting ready to go to the airport for my US return flight, police officers detained me, citing an anonymous tip that they had received. They confiscated our passports and belongings, and they executed a search warrant to search my parents' house. So police couldn't find any evidence that was useful to them, but mysteriously, a few of them came to my parents' house for a second house search, where they claimed that they found a US $1 bill. Nobody knows who found that US $1 bill and where it came from. I know you're confused, but just bear with me. I'll come to that in a moment. So video recordings of the search done by the police officers were missing despite my lawyer's countless attempts. Between July and August, for 14 days, I was detained with 3 other people in a single cell. I was questioned by many police officers 6 to 7 times in total, day and night, without a lawyer's presence. Most of the time, they woke me from my sleep and took me to an interrogation room. The interrogations would take hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. I would lose time. So after 14 days in detention, I was charged and arrested for overthrowing the Turkish government by force, carries aggravated life sentence in prison, which is about 40 years, and membership in an armed terrorist organization, carries up to 15 years in prison. So you're probably wondering, that's pretty heavy. So you must have done something pretty bad. Well, let's look at the evidence, what happened. So the so-called evidence claimed against me is that the police received an anonymous tip that I don't work at NASA, but work for the CIA, and I'm a member of an armed terrorist organization at the same time. That's number one. And number two is the police claim that they found a US $1 bill. And number three, my NASA ID card. Again, this is the three evidence that they used against me for what? For overthrowing the Turkish government by force and membership in an armed terrorist organization. Okay. So sounds interesting, right? Well, yes, I think it sounds interesting, and probably it sounded interesting to them as well. So, but the real reason is that I graduated in 2002 from Fatih University, which was a highly respected university at the time in Turkey, and was shut down after 15th of July 2016 by the Turkish government. Fatih University was part of the Gulen network, and the Turkish government claimed that Fethullah Gulen was behind the coup attempt. The Turkish government declared Fethullah Gulen and his followers as a terrorist organization and refers to the network as FETÖ, although Fethullah Gulen denies any involvement in the coup attempt. An important side note, however, citizens can be considered terrorists or aiding terrorists only if they're not associated with the ruling party or its allies in Turkey. So, so let me go into the specifics, and let me share with you the copy of the arrest sheet indictment showing the anonymous tip. This is the original Turkish indictment. I noticed that we have Turkish speakers, so they would understand, but for others, I did a simple translation. So basically, it says, detention of the suspect, SERKAN GOLGE, and it was received by the police at Hatay Police Headquarters, Communications and Electronics Branch on July 22nd, 2016. It says, quote, I want my name and personal info to be held hidden. SERKAN GOLGE is a crypto and important member of FETÖ, which the Turkish government claims it's a terrorist organization. He says he works for NASA, but he works for the CIA. I heard this within family. His father's name, I redacted it, will fly Saturday or Sunday, will fly back to the USA, holds an important crypto position. Well, I don't think it is probable cause for arrest, but I guess at the time it sounded like it. So the second evidence is $1 US bill. Again, this is from the official police report, indictment showing that they found a $1 US bill. I hope you guys can see it clearly. I did a simple translation, and police and prosecutors claimed, and the court convicted me by using, quote, while executing search warrant of the residency of suspect SERKAN GOLGE, a $1 US bill was found. An investigation showed that $1 US bill in an investigation in another investigation, a secret informant claimed that in the year 2001, a $1 US bill presented to me to bless my well-being by FETÖ leader Fethullah Gulen. The serial number is the following. So that's the second evidence. And so let us try to understand how I tried to overthrow the Turkish government and turned out to be a terrorist according to the Turkish courts, okay? So again, this is the $1 bill, just as, you know, it's not a special $1 bill. I don't know who it belongs to. Let's just pretend that it belonged to me and I just dropped it. It's a simple $1 bill, just simple. So let's do the math. Step one, random person whom I don't know claimed in another investigation that he received a $1 US bill from Fethullah Gulen in 2001. Step two, Turkish government claimed that Fethullah Gulen was behind the coup attempt. Step three, police claimed that he found a US $1 bill in my parents' residence. And police claimed that, the courts claimed that I allegedly received a US $1 bill from Mr. Gulen as well. I never did, which the Turkish government assumes is a secret badge for membership in a terrorist organization? Well, step 5 and conclusion. Serkan Golge must have participated in overthrowing the Turkish government because the police found a US $1 bill in his father's house. Congratulations, you guys cracked the case. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if a Hollywood movie comes out of this, a fistful of bad dollars, I would say. So the third so-called evidence is the my NASA ID card that was working as a contractor at Johnson Space Center. So let me quote. In addition, while executing search warrant of the suspect Serkan Golge, on his person a card presumed a NASA ID and belonging to Serkan Golge imprinted November 2018 and serial number 007 was captured. Well, presented here is another piece of evidence that the Turkish prosecutors and courts used to allege that I participated in the coup attempt against the Turkish government, and they claimed I was part of an armed terrorist organization. Well, notice that my serial number starts with 007. So CIA, NASA, 007, I wonder if they suspected, James Bond type of thing. So wait, you guys suspected that I work for the CIA, but yet you found a NASA ID? Shouldn't this immediately invalidate the charges? Even so, when was working for the CIA become a crime, So let's go back to my story and prison story, funny and sunny days. Again, after 14 days, I was charged with overthrowing the government and terrorism. And between August and September 2016, I stayed with 34 detainees in Hatay, in Iskenderun. It's a maximum security prison. I stayed with 34 detainees allocated for only 7 people. We took turns for sleeping. We slept on the floor most of the time. I mean, imagine that, 34 people, over 100 degrees in summertime in Turkey. But then I was transferred to an isolation cell, which would be my home for the next 3 years. The isolation cell was about 4 meters square, about 158 feet square, with a toilet and shower together. I could leave my cell for 1 hour per day. The one on the left is just a typical isolation cell refreshment area. That I couldn't find any picture of the room, but you could imagine that it's a small room, just small cell. So I stayed in isolation for 23 hours in isolation for 3 years. Initially, I was not even allowed to speak with anyone during 1 hour refreshment time. But after about a year, I guess they said, okay, let's give this guy a break. And they allowed me to speak and talk to a 1-star general. He was arrested after the coup attempt as well. He was the highest commanding officer in Hatay province. He stood against the coup attempt, but was not ruling party friendly. So he was given life in prison, although he did nothing criminal. So how was my life in the isolation cell? The isolation cells were meant for people sentenced to life in prison, like murderers or things like that, or for disciplining people. But I guess the Turkish government put me there to mentally break me and others, so I would admit to things that I did not do. And typical disturbances were not giving us books from outside to read, disturbing me every night by turning on and off lights intermittently after nighttime. Sometimes they would come and hit the doors just to wake me up for fun. There were over 2,000 detainees in my prison. but there were 11 detainees in adjacent cells who were arrested during the state of emergency. One-star general, 8 public prosecutors and judges, 2 civilians only, myself included, an ice cream seller who was 70 years old. Most of these people were arrested because, police either received anonymous tips by their competitors or they followed certain legal news outlets that criticized the Turkish government or allegedly used an app that could be downloaded from any app store. And as I witnessed this issue myself, detainees had the similar, sometimes exactly the same indictment text, even to the bits of grammatical mistakes. Well, that is just a result of mass arrests without any evidence, copy and paste. Unfortunately, that is how the Turkish justice system works now. Mass arrests without any evidence. So my trial and release story. February 2018, well, luckily, no charge for overthrowing the government, but I was convicted and sentenced to 7.5 years for being a member of an armed terrorist organization. Same evidence, but plus a bank account that I have used since 2000. In September 2018, upon objection from my lawyer, my sentence was reduced by an appeals court to 4 years and 12 months. Now they reduced to aiding and abetting to a terrorist organization. Again, the evidence is the same: $1 bill, bank account, and anonymous tip, things like that. But still not so bad, right? I started from life in prison down to 15 years to 7.5 and down to 5 years. I wonder if I pushed it, would it be less than 0 years? A physicist would never test, would never stop to test the limits. Maybe they would give me overtime. May 2019, I was released from prison for time served after a mysterious phone call between the presidents of the United States and the Turkish government. President Trump announced that I should return to the US very soon, but surprisingly, the Turkish Justice Department did not take this politely, and they took this as an announcement, as a sign of me escaping Turkey, and put me on GPS tracker and prohibited me from leaving a certain area close to my father's residence. On 2019, my GPS tracker was removed and the city limit was lifted as well. In April 2020, I was free to leave, but the coronavirus stopped all the flights, so I couldn't leave. But finally, in June 30th, 2020, returned to the US and started back as a contractor scientist at NASA again. So that's my story. So support from the United States, as Eugene said, there were many organizations worked on behalf of me, and community of concerned scientists worked very hard to contact the Congress, Senate, White House, State Department, and I am thankful for that. So in 2017 and 18, John McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year. And the government of the Republic of Turkey continues to unlawfully and wrongfully detain United States citizens, including Enver Bronson and SERKAN GOLGE, and staff of the United States missions in the Republic of Turkey. And it continues about talking about sanctions and request the Turkish government release us, or the Turkish government would face the sanctions. So in 2019, introduced by Senators Vickers, Cardin, Rubio, and Tillis, and Durbin, and Van Hollen, a bill to advocate for the release of the United States citizens and locally employed diplomatic staff unlawfully detained in Turkey. So United States citizen and national NASA scientist, this is Dr. SERKAN GOLGE, has spent more than 2.5 years in jail in Turkey and is currently serving a 5-year sentence on national security charges without any credible evidence of wrongdoing. Again, it continues about what action that the United States government should take, and recommends only possible way the Turkish government responded so far, sanctions. So support continues. State Department released many times, only a few of many. A press release from Senator Tillis's offices. And again, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met several times with Turkish Foreign Minister counterpart. I know he worked hard to secure my release as well. So this is about me, but what's happening in Turkey? Let's look at the reports. This situation in Turkey through international reports. Turkey, United Nations report details extensive human rights violations during the state of emergency. So as you can see, I am just one single example that happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And, you know, I had a lot of support from the United States government, from civil society organizations. But you know, there are still a lot of people in Turkey, in prisons, hundreds of thousands of people. So let's look at that. Numbers are just staggering. Nearly 160,000 people arrested. Many totally arbitrarily. Teachers, judges, lawyers dismissed or prosecuted, journalists arrested. One of the most alarming findings of the report, how Turkish authorities reportedly detained some 100 women who were pregnant or had just given birth, mostly on the grounds that they were associates of their husbands. I am number one witness of this. I met with a lot of kids. I mean, when I say kids, 18 years old, they were just arrested because the Turkish government was looking for their father. So instead, the Turkish government arrested the children or women, even pregnant women, even disabled. My wife's passport was revoked. She wasn't allowed to leave the country either, just because of me. The U.S. State Department 2019 Human Rights Report about Turkey. Although the Turkish law prohibits arbitrary arrest and detention, questionable evidentiary standards, and without the full due process guaranteed under law. So approximately 70,000 cases were pending trial, and thousands of people are still in prison. International reports from Amnesty International report 2020. Thousands of people were held in lengthy and punitive pre-trial detention, often without any credible evidence of their having committed any crime recognizable under international law. There were credible reports of torture and enforced disappearances. Human Rights Watch report, Turkey, 2021. Executive interference in the judiciary and in prosecutorial decisions are entrenched problems reflected in the authorities' systematic practices of detaining, prosecuting, and convicting on bogus and overbroad terrorism and other charges. European Commission report on Turkey. Negative impact of dismissal and forced removal of 3% of Turkish judges and prosecutors remain, both regarding independence and efficiency. Serious concerns persist regarding the quality of judicial decisions in terms of legal reasoning and factual evidence, particularly in terrorism-related cases. I wonder if they're talking about me. $1 overthrowing the government? Come on. Indictments often reflect allegations that are not supported by credible evidence. Well, according to the Turkish government, anything could be used against you if somehow you're associated with the Gulen movement. The lack of established links between the evidence and the alleged crime are some of the many elements that raise serious concerns. Well, these are some of the things to the Turkish, some of the calls. I will only present only a few recent ones from a former representative, House representative.
Serkan,
Yes.
just one moment. 3 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
3
What's that?
3 minutes. 3 minutes. You have 3 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm
Okay?
done. Thank you. Thank you. So we have long been concerned about the abuse of several severe criminal charges in Turkey in order to suppress journalists, civil society activists. So this is one of the examples to the Turkish, to call to the Turkish government. So this is basically end of my talk, and I'd like to thank to all of you, but especially to these people, Mr. O'Brien, former Secretary of State, to Helsinki Commission, to you, Mr. Professor Chudnovsky, and Dr. Everly from Committee on Human Rights, and Dr. Gergerlioğlu. He's the only single voice among all the politicians in Turkey against human rights violations. Well, I know you guys, you all worked hard and a lot on behalf of me, but as I said, I mean, there are no executions in Turkey, but like Iran or China, but people were given aggravated life sentences for no reason. Thousands of people, which carries a life sentence of 40 years. And there are still hundreds of thousands of people either arrested for no reason, and millions of families have been affected. As I said, I'm just one single person isolated in Turkish prison isolation center for 3 years for no reason. And I think we have a lot to do ahead of us. And I would like to thank you for your help, and thank you for your time for listening to me. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Serkan, for sharing your incredible story. Thank you very much. We now have to move to the question and answer session that will be handled by the Council of Young Scientists. And I'm taking the liberty to ask the first question to Serkan, and then it will go to the CYS. Has Turkish government ever apologized to you?
They wouldn't, because as I said, since I was arrested, just like many people, they are thinking that I'm a terrorist. I mean, I'm not, but as we listen to other speakers, the governments typically don't do that. They don't apologize. They don't accept they made a mistake. So, no. To answer your question, no.
Okay, thank you. Ben, please take over.
Sure, thank you. Serkan, could you stop your screen sharing? So people can see me. So I'm going to ask a few questions of each speaker, collected from the audience or from YouTube. So for James Millward on the Uyghurs in China, we got a question from Patty Evers. Is there a connection between China's repression of Uyghurs and the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative? If so, is this a main motivator for its policies against Uyghurs in recent years? James,
Can I go now? Yeah, okay. It's a very good question, and it's often assumed, and you can sort of read this even sometimes in analyses, that, oh, well, because of the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, the PRC needed to stabilize Xinjiang. Now, there's several problems with that. one, the Belt and Road Initiative is not really, it's not a plan of a new road, right? There are train and port and all kinds of projects, but it's not like they're actually building a road starting from China and going across Xinjiang and so on. There's infrastructure involving that, right? But it's much more of a brand that's put on top of lots and lots of various kinds of projects, some governmental, some done by Chinese corporations, and so on. But most importantly, Xinjiang was not really unstable, right? As I said before, there really wasn't a terrorist problem. There were issues of, of unrest here and there, but notably nothing that had attacked infrastructure at all. They had it pretty much under control. So although people think that, that wasn't the main reason I don't think that the PRC did it. Now, obviously, the fact that this was a big program, the BRI was a big program of Xi Jinping's and continues to be, is part of that. And I think one of the reasons for why Central Asian countries and other countries in the Middle East and even Eastern Europe have been relatively quiet about what's going on in Xinjiang has to do with their concern to get Chinese loans through Belt and Road and other kinds of programs. And so as a big piece of economic diplomacy, the Belt and Road is somewhat, I guess I've turned it around. The Belt and Road is supporting, as economic diplomacy, the Belt and Road somewhat supports the oppression in Xinjiang. But the oppression in Xinjiang is not necessary for the Belt and Road.
Got it. Thank you. And now we can switch to a question for Rose Parris Richter from myself on whether the U.S. should insist on human rights reforms during its negotiations over Iran's nuclear program.
Thanks for that question. I think it's a complicated one that has been hotly debated among the international community and Iranian human rights defenders. I'd say in my personal capacity that I don't believe that human rights should be placed on the negotiating table during any negotiations over nuclear proliferation. They are not, in my opinion, up for negotiation. And so, I think conflating the two processes is a mistake. I do understand that there are increasing calls to use every opportunity that member states want to initiate to engage with the Iranian government to talk about human rights. But I really don't believe that human rights are a negotiation point. I think that we shouldn't put this on the table for gains or lack thereof on other issues having to do with security and other interests that the U.S. government might have in the country. So that's my short answer.
Can I jump in with a quick piggyback on that? Because you could ask a very similar question regarding China. How can we negotiate with China about trade or cooperation on climate change when they're committing genocide, as some people, as it could be argued they're doing, or whatever, crimes against humanity. And it's often posed as an either or, right? Like a zero sum. But I'm not a diplomat, but I know some diplomats. And the art of diplomacy is dealing with different things at the same time and not letting the big problems undermine your other things that you can work on. That's what you have to do, right? There's no international relationship that is perfect. And the idea that, so we have to sort of remember that this is what diplomats do. And it's important for those of us concerned about human rights to kind of keep people's spines stiff by keeping the pressure on this. But they can and should negotiate about different things. You don't have to throw human rights under the bus to do it. It doesn't have to be a sideline issue. It can be a central issue, even while taking up these other things.
Got it. Thank you. May I can ask a question of SERKAN? So essentially, the Trump and other U.S. presidents have gotten a few people like yourself and Andrew Brunson out of Turkey, but do you think that the US government is doing enough to get other people released that were arrested unlawfully?
I know they did a lot for me and on behalf of me. And I asked this question myself, actually. That's a good point. To the deputy secretary of states, the ambassadors, and they always responded me. They're doing everything in their power through backdoor diplomacy. But it's impossible to know what's going on in the kitchen. So it's hard to tell. I guess I was more like in front of everything, myself and the other U.S. citizen, Pastor Brunson, and we just happened to be prominent figures. I'm pretty sure they did everything they could for other U.S. citizens, but I know a lot of them are still, most of them are still in prison, and as I learned, some of them had to escape Turkey through illegal ways. So that's sad, but I don't know the exact story for that.
Okay, I think we have a little more time, so I can ask Rose PARRIS Richter about to be more specific about what kinds of actions the human rights organizations and foreign governments can use to be most effective in eliciting positive changes from the governments of countries like Iran. Like you mentioned, international pressure and advocacy, but like what in particular can these organizations and governments do?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that the most successful approach so far that we've observed has been joint and coordinated efforts from various quarters urging the government to take a particular action. So, calls from both the UN member states, calls from international human rights organizations, advocacy efforts from Iranian human rights defenders that are diaspora or located inside Iran, all coming at the same time from various angles to call on the government to take a specific action has been, helpful in moving forward positive change. I want to say that, as someone who spends a lot of time assessing whether or not the government has implemented recommendations that the international community has offered it for addressing some of these challenges, it's been difficult to really provide analysis because some of the recommendations have been so vague, right? Calling on the government to do something like release all prisoners has been, difficult for us to measure practical changes and difficult to pinpoint to the government as to what specific steps it can take to make some of the incremental changes that are required for addressing international human rights concerns. So a recommendation like release a specific person or reform a specific aspect or article of a law have been, I think, really helpful in providing the international community with specific points of action, specific ways of measuring whether or not the government has taken real steps to make changes, and then be able to point to specific outcomes related to those specific calls, I think has been, a helpful way forward. But like I said, I think there needs to be sustained engagement, and people need to understand, I think, that human rights reforms are a slow train. They come, it's a slow but steady movement with, little sometimes evidence that positive change is coming. But I think that persistence is really important and has been important in the last decade in seeing some of the reforms happen that we've been observing. these past few years.
Got it. Thank you. So I guess it's already 1:59, so maybe I should turn it over to Eugene to close out the meeting.
Well, I would like to thank our speakers, first of all, for coming and presenting their points of view. We learned a lot from them, and we hope to hear from you in the future. If you have anything to share with the Committee of Concerned Scientists, please absolutely do so. And the Committee of Concerned Scientists, if it can be of any help to you, also please don't hesitate to contact us. And I would like to thank also everybody who joined this session on YouTube or on Zoom. And well, I wish you happy rest of the weekend. Thank you very much. At this point, I think that we are finishing our conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Okay, you too.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It was great.
Seeing you, Carol.
Good to see you all too.